It's a good, tight little house. We've never really had any problems. I'm sure you guys enjoy this.
A New York homebuyer gets more than he bargained for when a house inspection turns up a mummified corpse. For decades, the crime had gone undiscovered, the victim unmissed, and the killer unpunished.
Look at this.
Now, investigators face a double mystery: identifying the victim and finding the murderer. In a rural Indiana hospital, a sudden soaring death rate raises critical questions about one of the nurses. It appears a poisoner has joined the staff, but the proof is scant, and building the case will require intensive care. When faith is misplaced, the result can be murder, leaving investigators to solve another case of broken trust. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Nassau County, New York, on Long Island, is home to almost 1.5 million people. It's close enough to enjoy the benefits of New York City while maintaining a quiet, suburban lifestyle.
You can see, no water damage.
In the fall of 1999, a new resident made the final walkthrough of the house he was about to purchase. The solid, old structure had weathered more than 50 New York winters. Within its walls, a half-century of history had passed. Some stayed behind. Tucked in the crawl space, a 55-gallon drum sealed tight. According to the seller, it had always been there, too heavy to move. The homeowner assumed it was filled with construction debris. The buyer wanted it gone.
I tried to move it a couple of times. It's a heavy sucker.
That's got to go. It can't stay there.
Together, they managed to move it to the curb. But the trash collector refused to take it. Its weight exceeded the limit. Hoping to divide the load, the owner attempted to pry off the lid. Rust had made it almost impossible. Finally, he managed to breach the seal. The stench was staggering and unmistakable. Inside was a withered hand. The owner rushed to call the police.
Nassau Police Emergency Operator 475.
He'd only caught a glimpse, but that was all he needed. Detectives Brian Parpan and Robert Edwards arrived, along with crime techs. The owner described the situation. Detective Parpan took it from there.
The first impression was an overwhelming odor when we opened the barrel. Inside the barrel, we could see a hand that certainly appeared to be human. The barrel itself and the information that we had initially at the scene, we thought we were looking at something probably about 18 to 20 years old.
Before the barrel was moved, Detective Parpan ordered it thoroughly photographed, inside and out. Detective Robert Edwards devised his strategy.
We closed the barrel up at that time and decided that we were going to take the whole package to the medical examiner's office, where we could do a very in-depth investigation. You know, this is a little unusual. You come to somebody's house, a new owner is coming in to take over, and he looks in a crawl space and he finds a 55-gallon drum. We eventually find out that there's a body in it. Now we want to make sure there's nothing buried in the area around the house before we give it up.
When they could find no evidence of any other bodies around the house, the investigation shifted to the medical examiner's office.
We can put the others.
Investigators processed the contents of the barrel. Their most puzzling find, handfuls of granules or pellets.
I thought it was some kind
The detectives had no clue what they were made of or what they were used for.
pelletized plastics.
They tagged some to send to the lab. Next, green liquid.
Set this in the bag.
Again, its chemical composition and relevance remained a mystery. At least for now. Further digging put the homicide detectives into more familiar territory. A small purse emerged from the depths, its soaking wet contents practically disintegrating. Still, maybe it held a clue.
Can you get at it?
Yes.
And then, the victim. Mummified in the airless, waterlogged tomb.
Keep on.
Hiding a secret for so many years. The body concealed more peculiar objects underneath.
We'll save them in there.
The single stem of a plastic flower,
Not sure what this is.
Plastic.
a locket with an inscription,
Can you see it?
to Patrice from Uncle Phil, suggesting the victim was female. Some more liquid and some sediment,
Jewelry in here.
and among the sediment, 2 gold rings, one with the initials MHR inscribed inside.
That, the jewelry could certainly be important. We have a name, Patrice. We have a second name, Uncle Phil. So this gives us some background that we can search and try to find out who we're dealing with, who the victim is.
But the most obvious clue was perhaps the barrel itself.
Look at this. There's just some kind of identification on the bottom of it. We didn't see it before because it hasn't been over. Sharks, you want to get a photograph of that?
Okay.
Upended, it revealed letters stenciled and embossed into it, and the fragment of a sticker or logo suggested it once served a more legitimate purpose. The authorities would follow up on it, but first, the victim had to be freed.
Removing the remains from the barrel, it was quite laborious. It took quite a long time. It was done very, very slowly. The material that was in the barrel, eventually we learned was to weight it down, was removed ladle by ladle. It was separated. It was put aside for our lab to be tested. And then actually removing the body was done very, very carefully so as not to cause any additional damage.
The remains were sent to the medical lab.
Let's see what we got here.
Detective Parpan and his team turned their attention to an address book pulled from the victim's purse.
Oh, this is completely saturated. Sparks, can you get a picture of that, please?
The liquid had reduced the pages to little more than pulp.
Let me flip it for you.
As a clue,
Can you get
it
it?
didn't look promising.
Try not to tear it.
But
Oh,
a
it's got a
business
name.
card
Can you
tucked
read the whole
inside
thing?
the handbag showed a little more
Doctor's name.
potential.
Be careful with that because it's fragile, you know.
It came from a physician in Union City, New Jersey.
Boy, that's really...
Down the hall, the victim herself underwent an examination. Her mummified body was carefully measured. Even though time had shrunk her remains, her bones revealed her approximate living height, about 4'9". Her bone structure indicated she was probably in her late 20s and possibly of Hispanic descent. As part of her autopsy, she was x-rayed.
See that bridge work?
The films revealed she suffered a massive head injury.
Skull fractures.
They displayed unusual gold bridgework in her mouth,
Such a nice headshot.
and they exposed a great deal more. She was pregnant.
Near-term pregnancy. Look at that.
The cause of death here was somewhat obvious in the blunt trauma to the head. The pregnancy, which was a shock to everybody, gave us probably in our own minds an initial motive that we'd be dealing with someone this far along in their pregnancy.
Investigators turned their attention to the dental work, which appeared to have been made outside of the United
It's
States.
skip like that, isn't it?
the additional things that came out of the autopsy, and the forensic odontologist informed us of the dentistry, the unusual type of dental activity that was there, so we were dealing with someone from another country. So we were able to pretty much come up with a race, an age, and the fact that this person was obviously a homicide victim, but a pregnant homicide victim.
The autopsy told investigators much about the victim, but not the most crucial thing: who she was. After all this time, flesh still remained on her fingers. An outside chance her prints could be raised. According to standard procedure, some fingers were amputated and sent to Detective Charles Costello.
I was advised I was going to be getting fingers from the individual in the drum, and I didn't know what to expect as far as condition of the skin, the tissue, the body of the tissue of the fingers that I would receive.
Though still flexible, the shriveled fingers didn't lend themselves to ordinary ink rolling. To eliminate the wrinkles and expose the ridge detail, Costello used a hypodermic to inflate the tips with air. But the skin deflated too quickly. Costello revised his plan.
What I did, I took twine and devised a tourniquet. I put a tourniquet around the second digit of the finger. Same way you would stop the blood, I was trying to stop the air from leaking out of the finger. I tied it off as tight as I could. I again attempted with the hypodermic needle. Was successful in getting it to inflate and stay inflated.
He rolled and printed the finger. And after all that, a search of the New York State and FBI fingerprint archives revealed no matches. It's been said that you can tell a person by the company she keeps, and that is what investigators were counting on. The victim's address book, saturated and almost useless, provided the last desperate chance to find her identity. Most pages were stuck together, too fragile to move, too faded to read. Forensic document examiner Joan Fertner began to gently pry the loose pages apart. The process could not be rushed. As each page dried, Fertner separated it and returned the address book to the drying chamber.
What I had to do was take the evidence and I had to put it into a forensic drying cabinet, which helps to draw out the moisture, and that helps the paper fibers in the paper to become stronger so I can manipulate the pages better.
Detectives already had one address to follow up, from the physician's business card in the victim's purse.
No good. Non-working number.
The number had been disconnected.
Let's check the book.
Book on Jersey?
Got the Jersey book right here. Must have known we need it. It's right on top.
A New Jersey phone book provided a physician of the same name at a different address. Detectives were dispatched.
Yes, we'd like to talk about.
They learned the doctor had long since passed away.
Do you mind coming with me? I can maybe answer your questions on.
His daughter had taken over the practice, but had only kept records for 5 years.
I'm not sure if I'd be able to help you.
Even if the victim had once been a patient 20 years ago. Today, it was as if she had never existed. And that meant that someone had gotten away with murder. In New York, detectives Brian Parpan and Robert Edwards chased a phantom. An unnamed pregnant woman killed decades ago by an unknown assailant. They had a locket to Patrice, Love, Uncle Phil.
We have a doctor's name.
And they had her ring with the initials MHR. It was not much help.
Everybody's trying to come up with what that.
Detectives notified the missing persons squad, providing only a first name, and asking them to go back in their database to 1980.
Nothing at that time had been computerized, so we had people come in, begin to search, do a hand search of the records. We're looking at an area of well over 5 or 6 million people, and a lot of people go missing in that period of time.
Bobby, there's nothing here. I can't do anything.
Another dead end.
Not doing anything for us.
Yeah,
In the Nassau County Criminalist section, detectives like Charles Conti took a different approach, focusing on the mysterious pellets found in the barrel.
We are trying to determine a possible origin of the pellets themselves, or in this particular case, it might be related to the barrel in which they were found in.
The pellets burned, giving off the unmistakable smell of plastic. A chemical analysis determined they were polystyrene, used to manufacture common household objects.
If we can trace back an origin, we might be able to link that to a possible suspect who might have been in contact with the deceased.
Oh, can I speak to someone in manufacturing?
On the theory that the industrial pellets and the industrial barrel were linked, Detective Parpan followed a lead.
Detective Parpan from Nassau County Homicide Squad.
He was happy to find out they were still doing business.
And we were able to contact them. By telling them the stenciling and the numbers that we had on the barrel, they were able to inform us that that particular barrel was manufactured in March of 1963. And that barrel, because it had a sticker on it, would have been sent to a chemical company.
That company closed in 1970, but was acquired by another one. The detectives traced the lead to the new company. The quality assurance manager checked the lot number.
What's in these barrels?
He determined the barrel carried a green liquid dye that stopped being manufactured in 1970. The same green liquid that immersed the victim.
What are we doing,
Finally,
Brian?
the investigators felt they were making progress.
Just trying to get some information down here, Bobby, so we can try to get a handle on it.
They now had a timeline for the murder. Between 1963, when the barrel was manufactured, and 1970, when the dye stopped being made.
Present to back.
Present to back?
The people are there now.
But the building permits indicated the crawl space wasn't dug until the 1980s.
Okay.
So the murder had to have occurred after that date.
290.
Investigators wanted to talk to the homeowners who built the addition.
72.
Because of where it was found, it's found under a house. So we're looking at something that we feel is a short list of suspects. Our initial thoughts was, who built this extension? You don't expect someone in a house to leave something like this there. You would expect someone who had a chance to be there undetected might put it there. We knew it was going to present a problem.
And these people.
Yeah, get you something to drink.
According to records from City Hall, the extension was built in 1984, creating the crawl space where the barrel was found. Investigators paid a call on the owners of the house at that time.
1972.
They'd purchased it in 1971.
The extension was already there.
It was completed, yeah.
But they had surprising news.
They informed us that the extension was already there, and that it wasn't until they sold the house that a certificate of occupancy was actually signed and filed. The family you purchased it from.
The crawl space existed years before there was any official record of it, muddying the trail, but not for long.
Flower business, plastic flowers?
Plastic flowers?
Yeah.
They also informed us that the people that they purchased the house from, that he was an owner of a plastic flower company.
As the detectives inched closer to the possible identity of the killer, forensic document examiner Joan Fertner shed light on the victim. Some of the pages from the address book had dried enough to read. But after decades bathed in liquid dye and body fluids, most entries were no longer legible. Fertner used an alternate light source to decipher the faded writing.
The video spectral comparator is an instrument that's hooked up to a computer monitor, and there are a series of cameras and filters and light sources that allow you to see from the ultraviolet to the infrared range of the spectrum. And it allows you to see outside of the range that the eyes normally can see.
Among the first things the apparatus revealed were the name, address, and resident alien number of the book's owner, the female victim.
I knew we had hit pay dirt, and that this was something significant.
The investigators knew it too. Parpan and Edwards received the immigration records and a photo of the victim, Angelica Morrow Quinn, born in El Salvador in 1941, immigrated to the U.S. in 1966, and dead before the decade was out. She came to the U.S. to work as a nanny, then began working at a plastic flower company.
Based on the work that we did in the city to get information on Melrose Flower, we were able to identify who the owners of Melrose Flower were.
I'll be glad to hang on.
The company had two owners. One of them, Howard Elkins, also owned the house at the time the addition and crawl space were constructed.
We had spoken with all the other owners in the house. Mr. Elkins was the only one who was out of state.
Howard Elkins, the homeowner when the crawl space was dug, had become the prime suspect in the murder of Angelica Morrow Quinn.
We're going to check this whole area.
But the gap between suspicion and final justice can loom large. And investigators still had miles to go. Investigators had given a name and a face to an anonymous murder victim. Now they followed the trail of her killer. Before confronting their prime suspect, Howard Elkins, New York detectives Brian Parpan and Robert Edwards traveled to Florida to speak with his former business partner. He recognized photos of the barrel and said the company used to receive dye in them.
Matter of fact,
And it contained
Then,
dye.
Detective Parpan asked him about Howard Elkins.
And now that in itself was not unusual. He was aware that Mr. Elkins had had an affair while he was working at Melrose Plastic and Flower Company. He had no information on it, but he knew that he had an affair, and he also knew that Mr. Elkins' wife and father-in-law had found out about it.
The affair was with one of the employees, a petite Hispanic woman with long dark hair and gold bridge work.
What do you mean gone?
He didn't know much about her.
never just showed up for work.
One day, she stopped coming to work.
Well, ladies that come for work from...
He recalled that a short time after the woman stopped coming to work, he took a phone message for Howard Elkins.
My former partner, so... I don't
It was a landlord in Hoboken, New Jersey.
I don't really care what
He wanted to know if Mr. Elkins wanted to keep the apartment. The woman no longer lived there.
He showed up...
The partner gave the message to Elkins, and the next day saw him come to work with his car filled with boxes and a television set. The detectives were now absolutely convinced Elkins was their man.
The description that the business partner gives of this particular person, even though we're dealing with a mummified body, is exactly what we're looking at when we remove the body from the barrel.
Have a seat.
Armed with the information, but revealing none of it, the investigator spoke with Howard Elkins himself.
Did you ever have an affair? Were you with anybody?
He invited us in, and it was almost like a game. He knew we knew, we knew he knew, we knew. He was trying to find out information from us, and we were trying to find out information from him.
But he gave up nothing. Elkins denied he'd ever seen that type of barrel.
Jobs, workers, and I'm sorry, I know nothing about those.
Mr. Elkins, you're going to tell us you've never seen a barrel like that before.
He remained poised and indifferent.
And we believe you're involved.
The investigators wouldn't relent.
I know where that barrel came from. I know where it's manufactured.
We didn't pussyfoot with him at all. I mean, we told him that, as far as we're concerned, you killed this girl.
Excuse me, gentlemen, I have a call. Hello?
His wife phoned.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Elkins spoke with her for a few moments, then asked the detectives to leave.
General, I'm sorry. I really have nothing else to say. I can't talk anymore. I'd appreciate it if you'd leave right now.
They asked him to provide a DNA sample, but he declined.
I'll tell you what. We're going to leave. We're going to leave because you asked us to. But we're coming back. I stood right in front of him, and I said, Mr. Elkins, we're leaving. I want you to know something. We're going to get a court order. And I'm going to get a court order for your blood. I'm going to match your blood up to the dead baby and that dead woman. And we're going to come back, we're going to put you in jail for the rest of your life. You understand that, Mr. Elkins? You have a good day now, and we'll be back.
But that was the last time Detective Parpan saw Howard Elkins.
The next day, we attempted to get the warrants, and they were slow coming. That evening, we were notified, we were called to see if we had him in our custody. Apparently, his wife was looking for him.
He turned up the next day. His dark secret, kept hidden for 30 years, had finally destroyed him. The investigation continued. The medical examiner extracted a blood sample. The DNA was compared to the unborn child Angelica Marroquin carried. The baby was his. Work on the address book continued. Names and phone numbers were revealed. After 30 years, none worked, except one.
Yes, hi, this is Joni.
What we're doing is we're conducting an
Angelica's
investigation
friend had wondered about her all this time.
An incident that happened on Long Island.
When was this?
Well, it's just recent.
She told investigators she thought the young woman had returned to her family and was shocked to learn how her story had ended.
In a phone book that we're interested in.
She provided the detectives with the missing chapters.
How it appeared there and what you may know.
After losing touch with Angelica some years ago, the woman received a call from her. She said she was having an affair with her boss, but it was going well.
He's my angel. Every single night.
He rented an apartment for her and was going to leave his wife.
Now what happened to her?
But a few months later, it began to sour.
I don't know what to do.
Angelica told her friend she was pregnant, and her boss refused to leave his wife. Angelica had told his wife about the affair, and her boss threatened her life. Her friend said Angelica sounded panicked when she called. She asked her friend to come over.
Angelica!
And when she arrived at the apartment,
Angelica!
there was nobody there. The door was open.
Angelica!
The table was set for lunch. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of a fight. But Angel was not there. She waited for a period of time, and then she went to the local police.
Yes?
It was too soon to file a missing persons report.
He was married.
That was the last anyone had seen of Angelica Marroquin.
But you know, she said he treated her so well.
Investigators surmised between the time the friend spoke to Angelica on the phone and the time she arrived at the apartment, Elkins had shown up and ended her life. Killers often turn against those they love, leaving behind traces of their callous ways. Others prey upon those who empower them with blind trust. Clinton, Indiana, a small town of 5,000 people. But in 1995, that number started declining, suspiciously. The local hospital served the health needs of the residents of Clinton. The sick came here expecting to get better, and most of them did. In 1994, after a sudden stomach ailment, Ethel Roja was recovering beautifully.
I'm doing very well.
Oh, sure. I see you feeling better.
Her husband, John, could finally relax.
Bring us out, 'cause I have
Ethel would be coming home soon.
Things were going real good in intensive care. Doctor's report was good. Then I went to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat and a cup of coffee. I would say that about 15 or 20 minutes later, I came back, and the picture there was totally opposite of the way I left her.
When Roja returned, his wife was in cardiac arrest. No one could explain why this woman on the verge of recovery would suddenly suffer heart failure. To doctors, it was a mystery.
My wife never was treated for heart disease. Never. She had no medical record of anything along the heart disease line. Never took any kind of medication or nothing.
Well, three cc's of epi. All right, flat line still, doctor.
Okay.
Ethel Roja was dead. The official cause of death was acute heart failure.
Just gonna have to call it.
Ethel Roja wasn't the only one. Over the next year, the number of deaths at the county hospital's ICU continued to rise dramatically. Something about these sudden and mysterious deaths didn't seem right. The nursing staff grew suspicious.
Let's call it 137.
Hoping to find some explanation for the sudden rise in deaths, the supervising nurse reviewed her staff logbooks over the course of the previous years. Some disturbing patterns emerged. Between 1993 and 1994, the death rate more than tripled from the previous years. In those 2 years, they recorded 102 deaths. Many were elderly, but a troubling fact emerged. Nearly all were improving before their sudden demise. After reviewing all the charts, the nurse could find only one similarity. In a large percentage of the deaths, one particular nurse was on duty. The data suggested a chilling scenario. She took the information to the hospital administrator, hoping she'd overlooked something that could explain away her suspicions. But the numbers didn't lie. They had to face the possibility that a member of the hospital staff might be a killer. Patients at a small Indiana hospital were dying at an alarming rate. And it looked like their deaths were no accident.
Just check the heart one more time.
The awful realization climbed up the chain of command at the county hospital. They called Indiana State Police investigator Frank Turchi.
Detective Turchi. In March of 1995, I was contacted by the chief of police in Clinton, who had been contacted by the hospital attorney. Before we had our first meeting, we had talked to each other about what it could possibly be, and obviously your first thought is theft of drugs, something like that. You don't think of a murder investigation. That was probably the last thing on our mind.
Investigators met with the hospital administrators. They told him the accusation centered on one nurse named Orville Lynn Majors.
All indications are...
At the time, all the hospital staff had to go on were their suspicions.
I'm not sure what it means exactly.
Since they had no proof of murder, they couldn't even give Turchi the name of a single victim.
In a normal investigation, you want to try to find out who did it. Like it's a whodunit type thing. But in this case, it was totally in reverse. I felt like we had a very good suspect, but we had to figure out who he killed and how he killed them.
Turchi requested a meeting with the nurse, Orville Lynn Majors. He wanted to talk with him before the hospital tipped him off he was under investigation. Turchi was too late.
They had suspended him, and that he had already had a lawyer contact them, so we knew that it was going to be very difficult. That was probably the first stumbling point in the investigation.
The next stumbling point was the mountains of technical data Turchi and his colleagues had to collate. If hospital patients were being murdered, then the proof was buried somewhere in this mountain of records.
There were shorthand type nurses' notes that meant something to them. To us, it meant absolutely nothing. So we had to be totally educated on medical terminology and deciphering medical records.
At this crucial preliminary phase of the investigation, every detail mattered, whether it pertained to Orville Lynn Majors or not.
He was either going to be a suspect or he wasn't. But at the beginning, he looked like a pretty good suspect. But we wanted to be very open-minded with that, and I wanted to. It was very important to me that we eliminate any possibility other than him.
Word of the investigation leaked to the media. Turchi feared the publicity would hurt the investigation. But the angel of death stories offered a mixed blessing.
It made people aware that something had happened, possibly, and these people began contacting all their local law enforcement agencies saying, you know, when my wife or mother or husband, grandmother, whoever it was, died in that intensive care unit, we saw something that at the time we thought looked odd, maybe suspicious, but the last thing you think of is that nurse caring for your family member is killing them.
Okay, so we talked a little bit on the phone.
Turchi followed up on the messages he received from people who had lost loved ones at the hospital. A woman recalled Nurse Orville Majors injecting something into her mother's IV immediately before she died.
Before it was her medication.
The woman's death fit the pattern. The patient's health was improving up until the point she suffered cardiac arrest.
He started to leave the room.
Over and over again, investigators kept hearing similar stories of mysterious injections with fatal results.
That's what got the case off and running full speed, and at that point in time, we knew as investigators we had a real serious problem going on, and most likely a homicide investigation.
The case seemed to be growing larger each day. Turchi developed a database to organize the massive amount of information he collected. To prove Orville Majors was killing people, he first had to prove the alleged victims had died unnatural deaths. For the investigation to succeed, he had to determine the most likely victims of foul play. To help decipher the medical records, Turchi assembled a team of specialists, including Dr. Michael Ollinger, an expert in emergency medical care. He compared the suspicious deaths against the records of patients who died under less questionable circumstances. The suspicious deaths stood out. In each case, death suddenly struck a recovering patient.
We were, in fact, becoming medical detectives. We were looking at these cases, trying to determine, was this an unnatural or unexpected type of an event?
Investigators continued their fact-finding. They sought to gather all they could about Orville Majors and any other potential suspects.
So we interviewed nurses, doctors, healthcare people from every facet of the hospital, nutritionists, janitorial people, anyone that could have gotten in that intensive care unit, and either look at them as possible suspect or totally eliminate them.
But it always came back to Majors. One nurse reported seeing him inject a patient who died almost instantly. Dr. Ollinger instructed the investigators to chart the deaths based on their level of suspicion. They needed to link Majors to each death. Turchi took the most suspicious cases to Special Deputy Prosecutor Greg Carter. Carter remained unconvinced.
I know there are a lot of variables at work there, and that in order to charge and convict someone of a criminal act, you have to prove them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So the associations or patterns in and of themselves didn't really cause me to leap to any conclusions. That's a real problem. I mean, this hospital had virtually no record keeping.
In order to bring criminal charges against Orville Lynn Majors, the prosecutor required some forensic proof of poisoning.
We knew that if we could find a toxin in the autopsy, that would be a very huge step in coming up with a smoking gun, but that in itself wouldn't necessarily be the smoking gun. We knew that we had to somehow link that toxin to our suspect.
What do you know anything else? Do you know any
First things first. Turchi had to find the toxin, and that meant exhumation.
Made a determination.
Turchi began the delicate job of asking survivors for permission to dig up their loved ones for autopsy.
I should say that we're going to have to exhume her body and do an autopsy.
If the evidence existed, it was buried with the victims.
We will stay in contact. It was a very difficult time for them, obviously, and for us also. I think that the families that the investigators dealt with knew that they were doing the very best they could to try to solve this case and find out why their family member died.
Finally, the autopsies commenced. The medical examiner looked for a variety of toxins and found absolutely nothing.
When they did the first 2 or 3 autopsies and they never came up with an obvious cause of death or a toxin, we were disappointed. Then it became apparent to us that it was unusual in the fact that they were finding no obvious cause of death.
It was a new way to think about the case. The fact that nothing suspicious was found provided grounds for suspicion. In fact, it could be their biggest clue so far. Dr. Ollinger examined the EKG readings from the deceased patients to find a common pattern.
The pattern that we recognized was many of these patients that died, they would die from a sudden loss of heart activity. Their heart would be beating fine, and all of a sudden, over a matter of less than a minute, they would get a widening of their heart rhythm and then just flatline.
Dr. Ollinger reasoned whatever substance caused patients to die like that must also occur naturally in the body. That is why it wouldn't stand out in the autopsy. It would let the killer pass unnoticed. It would be the perfect poison. In Indiana, hospital patients were dying mysteriously. Investigators suspected poison. The medical investigators researched toxins that would kill quickly and leave no trace. Dr. Michael Ollinger knew of a compound that would work like that: potassium chloride.
Potassium chloride could kill a healthy person, and so it wasn't unexpected that if potassium chloride was given to these patients, it would have resulted in the types of deaths that we were seeing, which was a sudden loss of electrical activity of the heart.
To test his theory and build the case, Ollinger suggested investigator Turchi bring a toxicologist and a heart specialist aboard. He brought in medical toxicologist Dr. Brent Furby to lend his expertise. Because potassium is present in healthy bodies, if it's used as a poison, it would be difficult to prove.
When people die, within a few hours, usually their potassium goes up considerably. It may even triple. So determining that someone has been injected with potassium in a patient post-mortem, particularly if they've been exhumed, is really, really tough. In fact, I think it's virtually impossible.
The healthy heart uses potassium to control its rhythm. Too much potassium overwhelms the organ, causing it simply to stop. And though the presence of post-mortem potassium would prove nothing, a victim of potassium poisoning would show telltale signs of the toxin. Cardiologist Eric Pristowski was brought in to look for them.
Potassium is sort of the kingpin of the cell membrane. Potassium in the right concentration allows normal flow of electricity in a cell. If you suddenly give a very large amount of potassium that gets to the heart very quickly, what you do is you affect the heart's membrane so they cannot have electricity flow. And when that happens, the heart stops.
Do you carry this drug?
Not only is potassium stealthy,
Yes.
it was also easy to obtain.
Yes.
Detectives found that a nurse could take a vial of potassium chloride from the hospital supply without anyone noticing it missing.
This is where you keep the
A
drug.
vial of potassium chloride would provide the smoking gun investigator Frank Turchi desperately needed.
I obviously wanted a search warrant early for Lynn Major's property, and we just couldn't put it all together. The information we had received that would give us suspicion as to what he was doing was events that had happened 2 years prior to our investigation. So obviously it didn't allow us the time frame in order to get a search warrant.
Turchi tried to question Majors, but his lawyer would not allow his client to provide specific answers.
Thank you.
The case was in danger of stalling. Greg Carter and Frank Turchi needed stronger evidence to get search warrants for Major's home.
Presence of a substance which might...
I understand that you and Lynn are roommates, is that correct?
They contacted
Yes.
Major's housemate.
He moved into my house and...
At first, he was suspicious and reluctant to talk with authorities.
As to Lynn's
But eventually,
involvement
they won his trust. He owned the house that he and Majors lived in. He told investigators that one day, as he was straightening up the garage, he came across some vials of potassium chloride. Here, at last, was the elusive smoking gun.
Would be willing to sign that.
The housemate gave police permission to search his home.
This is one that we've prepared.
More vials were found on the premises. One thing led to another, and the discovery enabled investigators to get a warrant to search Major's van. More vials turned up. They were processed as evidence.
Frank?
Now that they had linked Majors to potassium chloride, they had to rule out any other possible causes of death. Many of the patients died of heart disease. But now that poisoning was suspected, cardiologist Bruce Waller was called in to autopsy the hearts to find evidence of that disease.
I would look for blockages in the arteries, look to see if there has been heart attack, and examine the remaining valves and other aspects of the heart. If the heart were completely normal, then we would be suspicious of some other toxin as the cause of death.
The hearts were healthy. The suspicions were confirmed. Investigators had gathered enough evidence to arrest Orville Lynn Majors on suspicion of murder.
The evidence concluded that Lynn Majors was taking a patient in the intensive care unit, developing the opportunity for him to be alone with that patient, injecting the potassium chloride into the patient, causing their death, and doing it to make it look medically like this person took a turn for the worse and died.
The investigation took nearly 4 years, but in the end, it paid off. Orville Lynn Majors was convicted and sentenced to 360 years in prison. There is no deceit colder than a trust that is betrayed. When that betrayal turns deadly, police turn to forensic science to avenge the victims of broken trust. In Canada, a young Russian woman is found dead in a bathtub, beaten and drowned in her own blood. Men fell victim to her charms, and police find at least 3 suspects with the means and motive to commit the crime. In New Jersey, a woman disappears without a trace. For years, police trail her husband and search for a mysterious box, the gruesome contents of which may prove his guilt. A victim usually never foresees danger when the perpetrator turns out to be a friend or a lover. Science and microscopic evidence can unmask these killers and find justice for those who are loved to death. In this program, some of the names of the participants have been changed to protect their identity. Toronto, Canada is a gleaming, bustling metropolis, rising high above the shores of Lake Ontario. Each year, thousands of immigrants find homes in this international city. For some, the journey leads only to danger and heartbreak. On January 12, 1995, Mark Milligan and Gilbert Ho arrived at the home of a friend, a 23-year-old woman named Paulina Gerasimov. Paulina had been missing for days, and her friends convinced the building superintendent to let them in. Her door was unlocked. The apartment was neat, clean, and eerily quiet. Gilbert Ho went to check the bedroom, and there he made a shocking discovery. The room was in disarray, the bed spattered with blood. It was a horrific, violent scene. But in the bathroom was something more brutal. In the bathtub lay a woman's body, submerged in bloody water. The skull had been shattered, but they knew it was Paulina. They called police. Police dispatch received a frantic call from Gilbert Ho at 1:40 p.m. Detective Sergeant Ken Taylor of the Toronto Police Homicide Squad was assigned the case with his partner, Detective Sergeant Mike Hamill. The witnesses were asked to give statements at police headquarters. Ken Taylor recalls the scene.
When we first arrived at the scene, we took a quick look just to get an idea as to what we would be dealing with. The door was open, and as I turned to the left, the bathroom is on the left as you're looking in the apartment. I could see a female lying in the bathtub. The door to the patio or to the balcony was open about 6 inches. It was a cold night, and it had been cold for a number of days, so that's why the apartment was so cold.
Investigators found a dog, which they removed from the premises. Detective Sergeant Mike Hamill.
The dog even was eating out of the dog food.
Whoever did this cared about her dog. There was some water in the dish on the floor as well. And I suspect the balcony door was left open for the dog to be able to go outside.
That's pretty interesting.
Nobody broke in, so that suggests to us as homicide investigators that she knew who the killer was, and that the killer either let himself in or she let the killer in.
The bedroom had clearly seen the greatest share of violence. Blood was spattered on pillows, sheets, and up the wall. Though their victim was found in the tub, she was clearly beaten here, and savagely. Detectives spotted a curious ring of dried blood, which indicated that something had been placed atop the dresser during or after the crime. They later found a cup of the same size in the bathroom. Police theorized that while the killer was cleaning up after the murder, he'd made himself a cup of tea.
Whoever it was comfortable in the apartment, probably knew that nobody else would be coming, and he had plenty of time to clean up.
Toronto Police Detective Richard Wisnowski of the Forensic Identification Services was dispatched to the apartment that afternoon. The victim appeared to have been dead for several days.
The first thing that I did was to photograph all the rooms in detail and then to start collecting any evidence that might prove useful to the investigation. Under the body in the bathtub, I found a hammer, which was most likely the murder weapon.
The detective also observed disinfectant cleanser in the bath.
This was a unique crime scene that I have not encountered very often, in the fact that there was the brutality of the murder and the condition that the body was left in.
Throughout the bathroom, Detective Wisnowski dusted for prints.
If it was a stranger-to-stranger homicide, then fingerprints and any evidence left in the apartment would be very important.
In the living room, he collected an answering machine tape, which could also help clarify time of death. But it was the signs of violence in the bedroom that seemed the most perplexing. The drawers of the dresser were open and clothes were scattered around, but it appeared that nothing of value was taken.
It wasn't a true robbery in the sense what I've experienced in the past. It looks like it was a staged incident, and it was a cover-up for the true intention was to commit the murder.
At police headquarters, detectives took statements from Paulina's two friends who had discovered her body. Mark Milligan had grown concerned when she wasn't answering her phone and had missed class for several days.
Yes. Did that today.
Paulina, he explained, was an art student at a local university.
Decided to go.
He was at that apartment because of his concern, because nobody had seen or heard from Paulina for quite some time. He was obvious, it stood right out at us that he was a friend, never a suspect.
Gilbert Ho was a boss of Paulina's at a bar where they worked in downtown Toronto.
Mr. Ho was very cooperative with us. He was, from what I understand, the one who started the sort of search party for Paulina.
But unlike Milligan, detectives were not able to cross him off their suspect list. He told police he was having an affair with Paulina.
Oh, well.
He was paying bulk of her rent, and it was obvious from what he said that he cared for her very much.
Gilbert Ho had last seen Paulina earlier that week, on Monday, January 9th.
Never seen this one before.
Certainly hope so.
The two had eaten dinner and were planning to spend the evening in her apartment when she received a phone call.
How are you?
Ho explained to detectives that he was not disturbed by the call.
You're more than welcome.
Paulina was very pretty, and he'd long ago accepted the fact that she had many men in her life.
Are you sure? Yeah.
She asked Ho to leave around 1:30 in the morning.
Okay, I'll see you later.
He assumed she was expecting another guest. In the days that followed, he left several messages on her answering machine, but she never called back. Paulina's body was sent to the office of the chief coroner in Toronto. An autopsy was conducted the day after Paulina was found. Although her body had lain out for days, the pathologist's task was made easier thanks to the bathtub's cool water and the wintry air rushing in from the balcony. Acting Chief Coroner, Dr. Barry McClellan.
So in a case like this, where the body is found in a cooler environment, that in fact is a benefit to us when it comes to preserving the tissues and conducting the autopsy examination.
They found ligature marks where she was bound at the wrists and ankles, and defensive wounds on her hands and arms.
She had an excess of 20 blows to her head, and the pathologist at the autopsy felt that the hammer was consistent with the injuries.
Doctors believe that Paulina, though severely beaten, was still alive when she was tied up and placed in her bathtub.
The cause of death was determined to be blunt force head injuries with possible terminal drowning.
Two clues warranted further investigation: semen found in the body and a human bite mark located on her upper body. Police would have to wait for a final autopsy report. Neighbors confirmed that Paulina had several men in her life, including a husband, a man named Ivan Joseph. Joseph was a businessman who had recently moved to Calgary, some 2,000 miles away.
He came to Toronto within a couple of days to be interviewed. She was estranged from her husband. As a matter of fact, they were going through divorce proceedings.
He explained that he had last spoken to his wife on Monday evening, shortly before her dinner with Gilbert Ho. During that phone call, she told him that she would be sending him papers that would finalize their divorce. Ivan Joseph had known Paulina in Russia. The two had been high school sweethearts.
How are you?
He immigrated to Canada in 1990. Paulina followed 2 years later. Within 4 months, the two were married, eager to start a new life for themselves in Toronto.
The relationship was good at the start, and then she started working, she started getting more confident in herself, and they just sort of grew away.
Joseph told police Paulina began coming home from work later and later, and the newlyweds began arguing with increasing regularity.
Oh, thanks for making dinner.
After only 3 months, the couple separated.
Relax.
We're supposed to spend time.
For the last 2 years, they had lived apart.
I don't have time for this.
Well, where have you been?
Ivan Joseph insisted that he and Paulina had remained friends.
Who have you been with tonight?
I was out with my girlfriends. I had errands to run.
For work.
We can talk.
Police, however, were suspicious.
Her husband was in Calgary at the time, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't have arranged something here for her. That nobody heard from her after this particular day was suspicious to us.
Hi, Mike.
Detectives now had 2 suspects to pursue, Gilbert Ho and Ivan Joseph. But with each day, it seemed, their list of possible perpetrators grew.
Ex-boyfriend?
Yeah.
According to friends, Paulina led an active social life and began dating a third man soon after her separation. She moved in with him in the fall of 1992.
I always keep my promises to you.
His name was Ed Casco. The two had an on-again, off-again relationship. After an argument, she eventually moved out in the summer of '94, 5 months before her death.
You know, bad girl.
Detectives were eager to learn more about this man and called him in for questioning. Like their other suspects, Casco was cooperative and seemed affected by Paulina's death. Though she'd left him and moved into the apartment provided by Gilbert Ho, the two still saw each other on occasion. Casco admitted meeting her on Friday, January 6th. He slept with her that night and left the next day. Detectives recalled Gilbert Ho's statement about a late-night guest Paulina was expecting. But Casco denied coming over to see her late on Monday night, January 9th, the last day Paulina was seen alive. Police now had to eliminate 2 of the 3 suspects. They looked to Paulina's body for clues as to which of the men who loved her killed her. In 1995, a young Russian woman living in Toronto was found brutally slain. Paulina Gerasimov was struck 20 times in the head with a hammer and left to drown in a bathtub. 3 men, all current or former lovers, were under suspicion. Detective Mike Hamill.
It's a process of elimination. You start off with a number of suspects, but the quicker you eliminate the less important suspects, the more time you will have to focus on your number 1 suspect.
Investigators turned to Ron LeBlanc, hoping to gain a better understanding of their victim.
Thanks, sir.
LeBlanc was the owner of a Toronto bar where the victim had worked. Gilbert Ho also worked at the bar. And Ed Casco was a customer there.
Just about the beer.
Gilbert Ho was our bar manager at the time. He was so distracted with her in every which way that he grew just progressively inefficient.
So you're hearing what I'm saying?
He started to spiral out of control because he could not concentrate anymore.
LeBlanc informed detectives that he had been forced to fire both Gilbert Ho and Paulina Gerasimov in the fall. Their trip to the bar left detectives with more questions than answers.
I can't think of any reasons why anyone would want to kill her. She was a fun-loving, easy person. She got along with everybody. She had no enemies in the world.
Detectives hoped her body could point them in the right direction. At the coroner's office, Dr. Robert Wood made a mold of the bite mark on the victim's body, pouring a quick-drying silicone-based cast onto the wound.
That is flowed over the skin, and then multiple layers are put on and allowed to set. We use this material in conventional dentistry, and it is extremely accurate.
The bite mark impression was like a three-dimensional fingerprint with unique characteristics that could ID a killer. The next step was to compare the bite radius of each suspect. Detectives asked each man to come to police headquarters and meet with a dentist.
That would, in our opinion at that time, rule these people in, rule them out.
Just open for me.
Doctors took skin cells for DNA comparison and made models of each man's teeth.
Now that can be done by any dentist, but I prefer to do the impressions when I can myself. And that impression-making process is essentially identical to anything that anyone would have done in private general dental practice. And we will also just look to see if there are any loose teeth, recently extracted teeth, teeth that have been possibly altered, just to make sure that there hasn't been anything done in order to disguise a dentition.
While Wood created his dental molds, forensic biologist Dr. Susan Kern analyzed DNA.
When we do the analysis, we have a known sample from the victim, we have a known sample from an accused or suspect, and then we have our unknown sample. We would do the profile for all of those samples and then look between them and see where we have similarities and where we have differences.
Kern compared samples from each suspect to DNA taken from the semen found in the victim. She examined the DNA provided by Paulina's husband, Ivan Joseph, comparing it to the sample found at the autopsy. After there was no match, she repeated the procedure with Gilbert Ho's DNA sample. Once again, there was no match. A third chart, and the same intricate patterns painstakingly traced. And there it was, 2 charts, their patterns in perfect alignment. It was Ed Casco, her longtime boyfriend.
The ex-boyfriend seemed to be, at the time of her death, very much involved with her.
Casco admitted to police that he and Paulina had quarreled on the phone Sunday, 2 days after he had last seen her. Results from the dental molds offered detectives another break in the case.
Hello, Kim. I'll send along a report.
After a meticulous comparison, Dr. Wood relayed his findings to police.
In bite mark analysis, often we will rule people out as well as rule them in. In this case, 2 people could be definitely ruled out, and 1 could not be ruled out.
One of the suspects that Dr. Wood ruled out was Ed Casco. In 1995, Toronto police investigating the brutal death of a young Russian woman had narrowed their field of suspects to 2. DNA evidence proved that Paulina Gerasimov had sexual relations with 1 man before her death. The man was Ed Casco, her former boyfriend. Teeth specialist Dr. Robert Wood had ruled out Ed Casco as a suspect. But violent bite marks on the victim matched another suspect, Gilbert Ho.
But we needed something more that would link Mr. Ho to the actual murder, to the body.
Financial records strengthened their case. Ho, who'd been fired from his job, was still paying Paulina's rent. Unemployed, he'd been bouncing checks for months.
Okay, Mr. Ho, have a seat right there, please. Okay. Hi. Yeah, you remember Detective Sergeant?
So he came down to the division, and we began interviewing him. We told him, as a matter of fact, that we believed, us as investigators, believed you, Mr. Ho, killed Paulina.
Detectives began their questioning by playing messages from the answering machine tape found in Paulina's apartment. The day after her murder, Ho had left several messages. Despite knowing the rent was not paid and she was to be evicted from the apartment, he spoke of getting together with her and buying her groceries.
Okay, talk to you later.
He makes several phone calls to her on her answering machine, probably to try and put us off, because he calls, "Hi, Princess, it's Tuesday, where have you been? I miss you."
Police believed that Ho expected Paulina's body would be found that day by police officers coming to evict her. But they never showed up.
He knew that Paulina's body was in the bathtub.
Ho also knew he had no money and had not paid rent on the apartment in months. Detectives confronted him with the state of his finances and asked him to explain the strange contradictions in his story. But he could not. They moved on to a more incriminating piece of evidence, the bite mark. Again, he had no explanation and denied having committed the act. The final autopsy report provided the final piece of the puzzle.
Well, hopefully it'll be good.
Stomach contents found at autopsy indicated that the victim had died about 1 hour after eating dinner on Monday, January 9th.
It's our belief, as a result of the stomach contents, that she was killed sometime around her supper time. The dinner that she was going to have was consistent with what we found at autopsy, and those kind of things, they don't lie. That's fact, that's evidence. She has broccoli, full piece of broccoli in her stomach. She has a full piece of carrot in her stomach. That's evidence, that doesn't go away. So couple that with Mr. Ho's statement that he was with her and nobody else was with her from 1:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m., it was obvious to me that Mr. Ho killed Paulina.
There remained one unanswered question. If Ho killed Paulina, then how could Ed Casco's semen still be inside the victim? Dr. Susan Kern turned to semen viability studies for answers.
Semen can be typed up to approximately 7 days. This case, the samples were collected additional days after that, and that would have been due to the fact that her body was in a very cold environment. The case occurred in the winter. The door was open, the washroom would be cold where she was found, and the temperature would be number one in slowing down any decomposition of the biological material.
Okay, Mr. Ho.
Detectives finally had their man. Gilbert Ho was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. According to the landlord, Ho had been informed that his tenant would be evicted on January 10th. Police theorized that he never told Paulina, hoping to maintain her affections as long as possible. It was a strategy doomed to failure. Ho had run through his savings. On January 9th, with only hours to go before her eviction, Ho showed up at the apartment
Hi, Gilbert.
for one last night.
How are you?
it's my position that she had no idea that morning that she was going to be evicted because nothing was packed. If she knew she was going to be evicted, you would have thought she's a responsible girl. She would have packed her bag. She wouldn't have just allowed the sheriff to come in, throw everything in garbage bags, and throw it out on the street.
Ho did not leave the apartment as he testified to police. And Paulina was expecting no late-night guest. Gilbert Ho was the last man who saw her alive.
Ho knew that that was the day. That particular day that he killed her, she had to be out the next morning. So he had no choice. That was the night. Because he couldn't afford to continue on with this type of lifestyle with her.
On June 21st, 1996, Gilbert Ho was convicted of the murder of Paulina Gerasimov. He was sentenced to life in prison. The corpse at a crime scene often speaks loudest, offering up clues to a killer. But a murder case is made even tougher when there is no body or crime scene at all. October 2nd, 1991. Deanna Weiss was anxious. Her mother, Fran Smith, should have been home. But for days she'd called and gotten no answer. Finally, a response.
Yeah.
It was John David Smith, her mother's second husband. And what he said shocked her. Smith did not know where her mother was. He thought she had gone to visit her.
Okay, yeah.
Smith felt sure she was overreacting when she insisted he contact police.
All right, bye.
He reluctantly agreed. Smith arrived at police headquarters in West Windsor, New Jersey,
Thank you, sir.
to file a missing persons report. He told the officer a couple of days before he had arrived home from work only to find a note left by his wife. It told him to feed the fish, that she would be back in a few days. Confused, he tossed the note in the trash. They'd been married a year and a half. Though she'd recently talked about wanting to travel, this was, for Fran, unusual behavior. Days turned to weeks, and there was still no sign of her. Deanna, Fran's daughter from a previous marriage, arrived in town highly alarmed, as did Fran's sister, Sherry Gladden Davis.
We handed out flyers and we talked to people all up and down the street where Fran worked. There is no way that Fran would have gone any place without Dee Dee or I, one, knowing where she was.
The women suspected that Fran's husband had not told the whole story. Local police also had their suspicions. Bob Hilland recalls the case.
I first learned of her disappearance while I was in uniform patrol, and back in the fall of '91. During roll call, we learned that a woman in our town named Fran Smith was missing and to be on the lookout for her.
According to friends and relatives, Fran was a friendly, stable woman who worked as an executive secretary. Her husband was, by all accounts, a quiet, hard-working engineer with a penchant for sports cars. Lead detective Mike Dansbury interviewed Smith several times in the months following the disappearance. Each time, he was left with more questions than answers.
There were a lot of inconsistencies in the initial report that John had provided to the police. Number one, Betty Fran was incapacitated.
A month before she vanished, Fran slipped and broke her hip. She was recovering at home.
Here was a woman who couldn't walk out of her own house or downstairs without the assistance of crutches or a walker. She couldn't drive a car. She didn't have any money, and all of a sudden she vanishes off the face of the earth and nobody knows where she is.
Fran's sister Sherry learned from police that Smith had been married before to a woman named Janice Hartman. She began combing phone books from towns and cities where Smith had lived. After dialing countless numbers, Sherry located Janice's brother.
I said, what's this about? And I said, I understand your sister was married to John Smith, and he said, yes. And I said, well, so was my sister, and she's missing.
His response was shattering.
My sister's been missing since November of 1974.
New Jersey detectives immediately contacted the police in Worcester, Ohio, where the earlier disappearance occurred. Detectives hunted out the old case files and found it bore a striking resemblance to the current mystery. 17 years before his second wife went missing, John Smith was the prime suspect in the disappearance of his first wife. She vanished days after their divorce became final. Her family blamed Smith, but prosecutors had no proof, and he eventually left the state. The woman's body was never found.
Law enforcement's attentions were raised significantly when it was learned that John had been married to another woman in Ohio. That would be Janice Hartman Smith in 1974, and she had disappeared under very similar circumstances. Then everybody became very concerned. What are we dealing with here?
More than a decade earlier, the Janice Hartman Smith case had gone cold. Now detectives had the Fran Smith case, and once again, the trail had gone cold. For more than 2 decades, suspected murderer John David Smith had baffled authorities. First in Ohio in 1974, and then in New Jersey in the 1990s. By 1997, the FBI's cold case squad, based in New York City, was eager to take a crack at him. Leading the new investigation was Bob Hilland, the former New Jersey patrolman, now an FBI agent, dedicated to solving unsolved crimes.
I knew how frustrating it was back in 91, 92, because there was a lot of work put into that case.
Smith's wives had a habit of disappearing, as did Smith, who skipped town once the local authorities gave up the chase.
He was transient by nature. We didn't really know where he was.
Finding a man named John Smith, the right John Smith, would not be easy.
We kind of had to start from scratch as far as going back and generating a timeline of places he had been, places he had lived, places he had worked, people whom he had known.
Hilland tracked down a longtime girlfriend of Smith's in Connecticut. Stubborn at first, she eventually revealed his location, California. Agents located Smith in San Diego and kept him under surveillance. He was working for a custom car manufacturer. They discovered he'd maintained his fondness for sports cars and spouses. Smith had married a 3rd time, and agents were concerned that she would become another victim. In 1998, Bob Hilland led a task force meeting at FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia. The plan: to take down John David Smith once and for all.
In the previous investigations, when John was brought in by law enforcement and interviewed, his immediate cause of action when he left the police station, he would go to his family, his friends, anybody that knew him, and he'd say, listen, the police are probably gonna come talk to you. If they talk to you, don't say anything. Don't even speak to them. And he would kind of give them a heads up. So the strategy here was, let's identify everybody in John's life from as far back as 1974 to present day. People who we felt potentially had information or could offer assistance in this case. Then we're going to go out and interview everybody simultaneously.
It took nearly 6 months to coordinate the operation, utilizing scores of agents. On May 5th, 1999, everyone was in position. And at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, the takedown began in San Diego,
John David Smith? Yes.
the Midwest,
Hi, man. How you doing?
and the East Coast, gathering up relatives, friends, neighbors, anyone who possibly had information that could help solve the mystery of the 2 missing women or prevent the disappearance of even more.
It was just a matter of time. No question in my mind about it.
I'm a special agent.
FBI agent Bob Hilland led the siege, coming face to face with John David Smith outside his office in San Diego. Hilland interviewed Smith in a nearby hotel room.
You should recognize
At
these
first,
people.
he cooperated.
They've been telling us some things that you haven't been.
With John, it's like playing cards. He wants to see what the cards law enforcement are holding so he can kind of strategize his next move.
They showed Smith photos of the friends and relatives who were also being interrogated at the same time.
We had a command post set up, and the other interviewers from around the country, as they were getting significant information from their interviews, they would call it into us.
I feel very responsible for what happened.
We made it clear to John that this interview and his interaction with law enforcement was different than any in the past. Now he was dealing with the FBI and the resources of the FBI.
Calm down. We got a couple more questions.
After 8 hours, Smith showed signs of weakening.
Lay down for a little bit.
He started crying. He curled up in a ball. He wrapped himself up in a fetal position, just crying. And he said, I want to cover myself with a blanket. I want the world to go away.
Ground information, please.
The FBI had better luck with John's brother, Frank, who was interrogated back in Ohio. Uncooperative at first, the younger sibling eventually gave in and provided investigators with their strongest lead yet. In November of 1974, just days after Janice Hartman's disappearance, Frank had come across his brother in their grandfather's garage. Prosecutor Jocelyn Stefansson.
He had asked him what was happening, and John told him, I'm building a box to store some of Jan's clothes. He said John sort of got upset about the discussion over the box, so he left. Later that evening, he returned to the garage, and he said it was just weird to him because he'd never seen anyone pack clothing in that manner before.
According to Frank, the box then stayed in the garage, unopened, for years. Then, in 1979, while the garage was being cleaned out, Frank and his grandfather opened the box. At first, he thought it was some rags. A closer inspection, however, revealed kneecaps, severed limbs, a partially decomposed skull. There was also jewelry, including a gold chain with a crucifix. Frank recognized them as belonging to Janice Hartman.
Grandma's heart's too bad. She'll never be able to stand.
His statement to us was, I couldn't do anything for the person in the box, but I was going to protect my grandma. And so he did not call the police. He instead placed a phone call to his brother. John's response was, I'll be right there.
John drove over to the house, put the box into the front seat of his Corvette, and drove away.
That was the last ever seen of it.
His testimony was valuable, but did not assure a slam-dunk case. Frank's grandfather was long dead. No one could confirm the tale.
We had no body. We had no crime scene. And although you can prosecute a no-body homicide case, which is something I was willing to do, it's very difficult.
The FBI searched the property in the area that had once been owned by John Smith or his family. They found no box.
I know that box exists, now we gotta find the box. How do we find the box? It's a proverbial needle in a haystack.
Time was running out. With each passing year, the body, wherever it lay, was decomposing. And evidence that could put John David Smith away for murder was literally turning to dust. In February 2000, FBI officials suspected John David Smith of murder and believed a mysterious box could prove it. In search of the box, Ohio detectives drafted a memo and sent it to law enforcement agencies across the state and neighboring counties in Indiana and Michigan. It was a desperate gambit. Made of plywood and crudely constructed, the box had last been seen in 1979. The chances that it had been found, preserved, and still contained the remains of Smith's first wife were slim indeed. For detectives in Newton County, Indiana, however, the memo triggered a memory.
Newton County Sheriff's Department.
He immediately calls the Wayne County Sheriff's Office and says, Brian, I think I've got your girl.
One detective recalled a case from 1980 when he was a young deputy sheriff. A road crew working on a rural county highway had discovered a plywood box. Inside the box, the dismembered remains of a female body. The body was never identified. Locals around town merely called her the lady in the box.
Just by good luck, they still had all the original evidence still in evidence storage. They had the box, they had the contents, they had her jewelry, her crucifix, everything described in the box they had. They had buried her remains in a Jane Doe grave, so she was out in the cemetery. The next step was we have to go to the cemetery and exhume her body.
It was March 3rd, 2000. More than 2.5 decades of police work had come down to this moment.
Now we had a body. We were hoping that we would be able to determine how she died, which is something that's always helpful in any murder case. We also wanted to make sure that we had the right body.
The bones were examined by Dr. Frank Saul, a forensic anthropologist at the Lucas County Coroner's Office.
The skeletal remains were in surprisingly good condition. The elements of the pelvis that told us that she was a female. We then examined the bones directly and radiographically and determined that although she was mature, she was young mature. And we told the agents and the detectives that she was probably in her 20s.
The description matched that of Janice Hartman, who was 23 when she went missing. The cause of death was unknown, though it was clear her legs had been severed just below the knee.
We had just the upper portions of the tibia and fibula. The lower portion of the lower leg, including the ankle portion and the foot on both sides, was missing and never found.
The severed bones were sent on to Dr. Stephen Symes, a forensic anthropologist who specializes in dismemberment.
These striations are so
A close examination revealed telltale striations and cut marks.
There's no patterning, no uniformity, nothing. They're going every which direction.
The cuts were made by hand with a blade that had a serrated edge and 10 teeth per inch.
Typical carpenter saw that you use to cut a 2x4 usually has fewer teeth in it. They're a little bit bigger than that. They're 6, 7 teeth per inch, for example. But 10 teeth per inch would be like a big bread knife or something like that you've got at home. It's a very strange thing to find. A serrated knife is very difficult to cut bone with. I would think it would take a lot of persistence.
John had said, if I can't have her, nobody's going to have her, and she'll never walk away from me. So the thought has been discussed that by cutting her legs off, she will physically never walk away from him again.
The final step was DNA analysis at the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. Genetic material extracted from the bones was compared to a sample donated by Hartman's mother. Both samples shared the same DNA sequence. Finally, they had scientific proof. The lady in the box was Janice Hartman. On October 3rd, 2000, John David Smith was arrested in San Diego. Faced with irrefutable evidence in his first wife's murder, investigators hoped Smith would confess to killing his second wife and reveal the location of Fran's body. But Smith refused to talk. Police theorized that Smith murdered Janice and then cut off her legs so she would fit inside the box he'd made.
I don't know what bothers me more, the fact that he cut her legs off or the fact that he kept her dismembered body for 5 years in his grandparents' house.
John's brother Frank received immunity for his testimony.
This secret nearly destroyed him. He told us that he had a nightmare of Janice chasing him and actually striking him with her legs, the legs that had been cut off below the knee. Although he kept silent for 25 years, there was a high personal price for that silence.
Police can only guess at the number of women Smith may have murdered. FBI agent Bob Hillen recalls the photo of a woman found in one of Smith's storage lockers and the fragments of teeth buried beneath a house.
What's going on?
He maintained photos of women and people he had known through the years, and for the most part we knew all of them, but there's one that's outstanding. We don't know who this person is. We don't know if she's a former girlfriend, former wife. We don't know if she's alive or if she's dead.
On July 18th, 2001, John David Smith was convicted for the murder of Janice Hartman. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. If charged in New Jersey with the murder of Fran Smith, he will be eligible for the death penalty. Her case is still open. Her whereabouts remain unknown. After more than 25 years, Janice Hartman was finally laid to rest in Ohio. The family of Fran Gladden Smith hopes they won't have to wait that long. A victim often has no warning when a loved one turns predator and the game is murder. But with the aid of microscopes, computers, and dogged police work, investigators can bring to justice those loved to death. A young Michigan woman accepts the job of a lifetime and disappears. Now it's the authorities' job to find her. The only clues are some suspicious emails and her new employer's shady past. In New York, an ambitious college student has her whole life ahead of her until she crosses the path of a killer. It's a random murder, the hardest kind to solve. But forensics reveals an unexpected pattern, leading to a game of cat and mouse with the prime suspect. Clues, eyewitnesses, police records. All of these help investigators. But each provides small consolation when the victim or the killer has vanished. In this program, some of the names have been changed. March 25th, 2000, Newport, Michigan. Call it a mother's intuition. When Carolyn Troughton received an email from her daughter Suzette, who'd moved out of state, it was supposed to reassure her. Instead, she called the police.
Police Tactical Operations, Anthony Burnell, may I help you?
The Overland Park, Kansas police dispatcher connected her with the missing persons unit. Mrs. Troughton explained that Suzette left for Kansas to work for a man named John Robinson. Suzette had packed her belongings and taken her dogs, promising to write or phone. But her mother hadn't heard from her in weeks, until she got the email that didn't sound like her daughter. Detective Greg Wilson of the Overland Park, Kansas PD was assigned the case. Experience told him it was not unusual for young people to move away from home and lose contact with their families. But Suzette, it seemed, was an exception.
Suzette would contact her mother by phone, as well as emails, at least 2 or 3 times a day. Since she'd moved to Kansas, the contacts immediately dropped off. So that was of concern to Suzette's mother, as well as the fact that she said that there was never in Suzette's life more than 2 or 3 days at a time that Suzette would go without speaking with her mother.
When she left, Suzette, a nursing student, was excited by the opportunity to care for Robinson's elderly father. Police became concerned when they learned about her employer.
John Robinson was known to some of the investigators in Overland Park that had dealt with him back in the 1980s, and they knew that he had been a long-time career criminal.
In the 1980s, Robinson had been linked to several missing girls, but had never been charged with any crime connected to their disappearance. Investigators from the Overland Park Police wanted to gather all possible information about Suzette's whereabouts before confronting Robinson. Police went to her last known address, a motel.
Hi, I'm Detective Bobby Humholt with Overland Park Police Department. My partner Greg Wilson.
The clerk recalled Suzette because she had 2 little dogs, which weren't allowed.
She had a couple dogs.
Once Suzette was told about the policy, the clerk never saw the animals again. The clerk said Suzette's room was paid for by Robinson. He put the room on a business account from a company called Specialty Publications.
And there's your receipt, Mr. Robinson. Thank you.
Suzette stayed at the hotel for 16 days and had checked out on March 1st, almost 3 weeks earlier.
If you think of anything else, could you
The
please
clerk
give me a
provided the security camera tape from that date, which provided investigators with a current picture of Robinson. Then detectives spoke with the housekeeper, who recalled that Suzette had occupied room 216.
Describe him to me.
She remembered that on the day the girl checked out, a man, matching Robinson's description, loaded her luggage into the back of a pickup truck. The housekeeper even described the truck and the luggage. The motel was Suzette Troughton's last known location, but it was located outside Overland Park's jurisdiction. The investigators brought in the Lenexa, Kansas Police Department to help them with this baffling case. Detective Wilson met with Sergeant Rick Roth of the Lenexa Police, sharing what he'd found at the motel. Wilson also told Lenexa PD that this was not the first time they had heard of John Robinson.
We had some good background information on John Robinson, and certain aspects of the disappearances of the girls in the 80s kind of meshed with the disappearance of Suzette.
In the previous cases of missing women, investigators could never find enough to prove their suspicions. And Robinson proved a difficult man to investigate.
The things that really didn't work in the 80s, going and talking to Robinson right away, what that did for him is it let him know that law enforcement was looking at him, that they were actively looking for these people that were missing.
Police believe this gave Robinson time to cover his tracks. Sergeant Rick Roth wanted to talk with the retired detectives who worked the earlier case.
We're going to give it a try. We brought them in, interviewed them. We had their official reports. However, we wanted to get a little further and get their personal views, what went correct in their investigations, what went wrong, their gut feelings, the little tidbits that were not in the police reports.
The more he learned about Robinson, the more Detective Roth began to fear he was running out of time if he hoped to find Suzette Troughton alive. The detective started by trying to track down Suzette's missing possessions.
555-3344.
They made cold calls to area mini storage companies,
Yes, hello.
looking for one that rented space to John Robinson.
Yes, thank you.
They found one.
Detectives went there as a punch key entrance, obtained the records, and found out he had actually been there on March 1st.
That was the same day Robinson checked Suzette out of the motel. Investigators next focused their attention on trying to find her dogs.
The family had told us that if we found Suzette's dogs, that something bad had happened to Suzette. They were like her children.
Officers used the same cold call technique and found Suzette's 2 dogs. They were adopted after being left at a shelter. Investigators now feared their missing persons case had become a homicide investigation.
When we did find the dogs, it was kind of confirmation on our feelings that she was, in fact, dead.
As police began to fear they might never find Suzette Troughton alive, all they could do now was work to try to find her killer before he struck again. As police continued the search for a missing girl in Kansas, they focused their attention on the man who had last seen her, a career criminal named John Robinson. Police wanted to keep a close watch on Robinson, but they didn't want to make him aware of their investigation. Sergeant Rick Roth.
From the lack of luck in the past interviewing John Robinson, we were not going to contact him. And basically, we threw every detective we had into the investigation.
Police put Robinson under surveillance. He was married and living with his family in a modest home. For seasoned investigator Dawn Lehman of the Lenexa Police Department, his habits seemed odd.
He would do activities during the day, mainly by himself. Would go and visit women that he had coming into town. He would meet them at hotels. Most of his activity during the day was outside of the family, whereas in the evening, he was generally home by like 4 or 5 o'clock, and he was kind of, at that point, the family man.
Investigators collected his trash, hoping to find something incriminating. Something to link him to Suzette Troughton or to his cloudy past. Besides his residence, Robinson also owned a small farm with several houses on it. Detective Lehman photographed it.
Just to the right of the residence was a small shed, and next to the small shed were just looked like some junk, like some lawnmowers, barrels, things like that, just kind of overgrown area.
But a more immediate clue was coming together at the police station, where a bag of shredded documents was found among Robinson's trash. Strip by strip, detectives found their next leads. Phone records, credit card bills, and internet records. But one piece of evidence stood out.
We found a bill for storage locker over in Raymore, Missouri. When the investigators went over there to talk to the storage company, they were able to find that John Robinson actually had another locker there at that same site, but it was actually in one of the other victims' names.
At this point, all the police had were suspicions. They would need some hard evidence to secure a warrant to search the storage locker. They turned to his phone records for that evidence. The records indicated that he'd called Suzette hundreds of times, but not after he'd checked her out of the hotel.
Newport.
He'd also placed calls to several other women, including 2 in Canada.
Another one.
Some of these women were later found to have visited Robinson in Kansas hotels, as Suzette had done.
Ontario.
Every name we ran across associated with John Robinson, we looked at as potential victims.
5 a.m. right there. Yep.
The Suzette Troughton investigation began to suggest Robinson's larger pattern of criminal behavior.
Yeah, we got one over here I think you need to take a look at. Yeah,
we had no idea what their role in this entire game was. We didn't know if possibly they were accomplices in a disappearance of Suzette. We had no idea what their role was, and we couldn't contact them because we did not want to tip off John Robinson that we were investigating him.
Because the police still didn't want to tip Robinson off to the investigation, they enlisted help from Suzette's mother back in Newport, Michigan. She agreed to help them gather information about him by recording his phone conversations. She would keep calling him, demanding information about her daughter, hoping he would incriminate himself. But he was too slick. He told her that Suzette was traveling with another man, and he hadn't heard from her either. He never said anything that would help police. Robinson's story seemed unlikely, but the calls did appear to prompt a letter from Suzette, postmarked San Jose. Her mother remained unconvinced. Everything about it was wrong, from what Suzette said to the fact that it was typed. Again, Carolyn Troughton notified the police. Paul Morrison was the Johnson County, Kansas DA assigned to the case.
And these letters that are trickling in from Mexico, from California, talking about what a great time she's having with this new gentleman that she's taken up with. We didn't believe it for a second, but I think the point here is that, number one, we didn't know if we were ever going to find her body. We did believe that she was dead, and we knew early on that we were dealing with somebody that is much more sophisticated than your typical criminal.
It seemed John Robinson had a talent for getting away with his crimes, including the disappearances of 3 other Kansas women more than a decade earlier. From what investigators could tell, everything Robinson did was spun out of deceit.
He was a con artist. Most of his crimes involved financial crimes. He never worked for a business that he didn't rip off, and from what we could tell, he never met anybody he didn't rip off.
Just as police were beginning to fear they may never learn the truth about John Robinson, they got a call from a woman who had seen him for the man he truly was. In Kansas, Suzette Troughton is missing and presumed dead. Police fear the suspect, John Robinson, may be a serial killer, but they have no proof.
You have to go find John.
Until they receive a desperate call from a terrified woman.
Sexually assaulted in my room.
Robinson had lured her from Texas, and she now gave police some crucial information. Sergeant Rick Roth was one of the principal investigators.
Anybody named John Robinson.
The woman had gone to the office in a rather agitated state and asked who had rented the room that she was in. Management told her it was John Robinson. This woman knew him as James Turner. That further infuriated her, and she started yelling and screaming about the fact that she had been battered and that he had stolen from her.
Armed with this victim's statement, police finally had what they needed to confront John Robinson directly. When they arrived, he was home alone.
Mr. Robinson, a couple of things that we want to talk to you about.
They asked him about Suzette Troughton and other missing women. He pled ignorance.
We'll just hold it right there because actually you're under arrest.
Investigators arrested him for battery and felony theft based on the Texas woman's statement. Search warrant in hand, a small army of detectives and crime scene officers descended upon Robinson's home. As the suspect himself was shuttled off for questioning at police headquarters. It appeared Robinson lured vulnerable women to Kansas with the promise of friendship, jobs, or exciting sex. He set his trap using email, so investigators confiscated his computers. Police also collected bills for storage lockers, credit card statements, and hotel receipts. Lenexa detective Dawn Lehman notes some of the other discoveries.
We recovered several books on creating new identities, make someone disappear, things like that. We recovered letterhead from the CIA, DEA, ATF. We even collected several pieces of information from some of the women from the early 80s that he had kept documents of or notes, probably to keep track of who he had spoken to with their families.
Missing was any evidence leading to Suzette Troughton. Investigators hoped to find it in his computers. Detective Mike Jacobson of the Overland Park, Kansas PD was assigned the task of analyzing the contents of Robinson's computers.
What they wanted us to look for were other victims. Are there other pictures of women or men on these computer systems, people that we don't know about? And in fact, we did find some of those types of pictures. They wanted to know about communications. Were there communications between John Robinson and others, specifically Suzette Troughton and other victims as they were identified?
Investigators determined that the email supposedly sent by Suzette to her family in fact originated from John Robinson's email account. That suggested that Robinson himself had sent them. Police hoped for a more substantial link in Robinson's storage units.
I don't know if at that point we ever thought that there was actually, bodies or anything in the storage lockers, but we felt that there was something that would connect him to these missing women.
They weren't disappointed. Investigators found Suzette's luggage, her computer, clothing, identification, and other personal possessions.
Here's Suzette's driver's license and her social security card. Get that?
More incriminating was a stack of stationery pre-signed with Suzette's signature. It was accompanied by a list of addresses and birthdays of Suzette's friends and family. This was the first real indication that Suzette was dead. But if police were going to prove she had been murdered, they had to find her body. Investigators started at the place Robinson knew best, his own farm. Cadaver dogs led officers through the brush and right to a pair of large barrels. Detectives meticulously broke the seal on one of them. Inside, they found a body.
Got her.
The second barrel also contained a body. They now had proof that John Robinson was a killer. Detective Greg Wilson of the Overland Park, Kansas PD.
We don't deal with a lot of murders, thank goodness. When you become a police officer, you hope that you never have to deal with a situation like this. You know, the whole thing was almost overwhelming.
Now, investigators had to determine what had happened to these victims and who they were. It was an enormous challenge. One they presented to Shawnee County, Kansas Deputy Coroner Donald Poyman.
Normally the bodies come in a sealed body bag and we know how to examine the bodies. In this case, just deciding how to get the bodies out of the barrels and preserve the evidence was a very tricky situation. Not only because of the logistics of them being extremely heavy, but we had a lot of tissue that had liquefied.
Poyman determined that both victims were young females, and both were killed by a hammer strike to the skull. One had been dead about a month, the other up to 2 years. Upon learning that the bodies had been found on his land, Robinson asked to speak with his lawyer. Investigators respected his request, but not before showing him the room full of evidence they had gathered against him. It included photos of his victims, maps, and surveillance logs. Investigators believed it was finally Robinson's time to wait. After months of investigating suspected serial killer John Robinson, authorities in Kansas finally had him in custody. From the local jail, he and his lawyer were trying to find a way to prove his innocence.
I've been arrested for sexual battery.
So far, the only charges against him were battery and larceny related to the woman from Texas. But with 2 bodies found on his property, Sergeant Rick Roth was determined not to stop until he had brought this man he believed was a cold-blooded murderer to justice. Robinson had slipped away once before. This time, he would not get away.
This was a huge case, biggest case ever worked at Lenexa as far as manpower and time. For 2.5 months, we threw every detective we had into it. And then after Robinson was arrested, I mean, it increased to like 35 detectives working this case. It was a huge strain on manpower.
Investigators focused their attention on the evidence. Their first job was to identify the victims found on Robinson's farm. Dr. Daniel Winter, forensic odontologist, was asked to assist with the identification.
In the case of Suzette Troughton, we were provided ante-mortem charts and x-rays by her treating dentist. I took x-rays and charted and took photographs also.
If Winter could match the 2 sets of x-rays, then he could say with certainty that investigators had found the body of Suzette Troughton.
We see fillings that are identical between the ante-mortem and the post-mortem x-rays. These are enough points to make a positive identification.
Dental records proved that one of the victims was Suzette Troughton. Investigators also ID'd the other victim as a woman who had been reported missing. They then focused all energy on connecting Robinson to Suzette's murder. They began by studying the letters Suzette's mother had received. Here, too, the tale would be told in the lab. At the Kansas City Police Department, Chief Criminalist Frank Booth extracted DNA from Suzette's body. He hoped to compare it against cellular material pulled from the envelopes that Suzette supposedly sent her family. He wanted to see who had actually sent the letters.
If I can detect that underneath the flap of the envelope, I can then know that I've got an indication I've got saliva. In addition to that, you also slough off epithelial cells from the inside lining of your mouth. These cells are very distinctive in their appearance, and they also contain the DNA that can identify who licked the envelope.
It wasn't Suzette Troughton. The DNA on the envelopes matched a sample taken from John Robinson. He must have sent the letters to avoid arousing suspicion about Suzette's fate. Robinson's connection with Suzette was linked at a molecular level. Hair and blood cells found in Robinson's storage unit were consistent with Suzette's. And a fingerprint on Suzette's driver's license belonged to Robinson.
I believe Suzette Troughton thought she had the opportunity of a lifetime when she traveled down here. She was supposed to get a salary of $65,000 a year, a leased car. She was supposed to stay in a 5-bedroom mansion. She was going to travel the world with John Robinson and his elderly father, which was supposed to be her job, was taking care of him.
She never saw it coming. It couldn't be disputed. John Robinson murdered Suzette Troughton and several other women. The evidence had finally caught up with him. It was a fact that did not surprise DA Paul Morrison.
John Robinson had been killing people for over a decade and a half, and he'd never been caught. He knew he'd been investigated at least a time or two for that, and he'd always beat it. So I think to a certain extent, there's a certain amount of arrogance that comes into play, and John Robinson is a very arrogant man.
But John Robinson could not outsmart the evidence. He was charged with 2 counts of capital murder and 1 count of first-degree murder. He received the death penalty. John Robinson crafted elaborate schemes to get close to his victims. And in the end, this lethal proximity made it impossible for him to hide. But when the killer is a stranger who strikes and then vanishes, he or she can become nearly invisible. New York, a city of glamour and grit, a town of dreams and all too often harsh realities. In June 1998, a woman on her way to work can't believe what she sees. A body lies across the stairwell of her East Harlem apartment building. The woman called police. The NYPD and an emergency medical team arrived within minutes. But there was no emergency. It was clear that the young woman had been dead for some time. Investigators determined she had been sexually assaulted. And with no identification, that was all they knew about her. Homicide detective Rob Mooney had his work cut out for him.
We weren't sure if she lived in the building that she was found in, and because of the lack of obvious trauma, there was no real cause of death obvious at the scene.
Investigators would have to wait for the autopsy to determine how she died.
The detectives that initially responded to the scene carried it as what we call an investigate DOA, because there was no cause of death known to them and nothing obvious, and there wasn't anybody at the scene telling us what happened to this woman.
At the medical examiner's office, the autopsy confirmed that the victim had been sexually assaulted. The technicians performed a rape kit and collected DNA evidence in the event they identified a suspect. The autopsy also showed that her death was not an accident.
The medical examiner's office gives us the cause of death as asphyxiation due to chest compression, meaning that somebody or something was heavy enough and exerted enough pressure on her chest to cause her to be unable to breathe.
Police went back to the apartment building and canvassed the residents to find out if anyone knew anything about the girl. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious. And no one had ever seen the girl before. Then, investigators got a call from a woman who was worried that her daughter was missing. Police spoke with the mother. She told them her daughter's name was Rashida Washington. She described Rashida as an ambitious 18-year-old who was working to put herself through college. Police now had a name to try to match with the victim.
police department has a unit that's assigned to the medical examiner's office, missing persons unit that works there. And when they get a report of a missing person, they normally, through course normal business, will match up missing persons reports with unidentified remains. And that was how the identification was made.
We have a victim.
The woman found murdered was Rashida Washington.
Young lady over on 720 West.
But no one knew how she ended up dead in the building.
Washington.
It was several blocks from her home
She was identified. She works
and wasn't
late.
anywhere near her college campus.
She was going to New York City Community College. Could you check on that? Get the.
Investigators went to the school she attended.
Hey, how's it going? Good.
They pored over her class lists, looking for someone who could connect her to the building where she was found.
Looks good, man. Thanks.
They could find no link. There seemed to be no logical reason for her to be in that building. Next, they went to the dress shop where she worked. They hoped that possibly the manager could shed some light on the mystery of what happened to Rashida Washington.
The last time I saw
The manager told them that Rashida stayed late and did not mention any plans she had made after work.
We found out that she had left work, I think about 9:30 at night, the last day that she was alive, and as far as anybody could tell, took the train as she normally did, and then never made it home.
Police hit another dead end. Investigators again turned to those closest to Rashida.
It's important to find out who's responsible. We can't give it a slow approach. It's got to be done right, and it's got to be done as quickly as possible to try to prevent further crimes from being committed.
They were trying to find out if she had any enemies,
We won't talk about that.
anyone she was arguing with, or if she was mixed up with the wrong crowd.
Her family and friends and co-workers were shocked to find out that she had been the victim of a murder. She was not the kind of person that you would normally find in this position.
Desperate for answers, Rashida's family and friends posted flyers throughout the neighborhood.
Clearly, because we had no real lead to work on at that stage of the game, then you have to start with her. And you start to talk to all the people around her. And then that circle begins to expand as you go on to see if we can find out exactly what happened to her. Rashida's case was pretty much of a mystery.
With no information to go on, the Rashida Washington rape and murder investigation faltered. Then, 3 months later, police confronted another case of rape. This time, the victim survived. She accused a resident of her apartment building. The man was arrested and imprisoned for the crime. But in this case, investigators may not have gotten the right man. In New York City, police are struggling to solve the murder of 18-year-old Rashida Washington. They believe that they have their suspect behind bars. But cutting-edge science is about to point the investigation in a new direction. In 1998, state and federal crime labs were setting up DNA databases for criminal cases. While adding the DNA from the perpetrator of the second rape into the database, the lab made two crucial and totally unexpected discoveries. First, the man imprisoned for the crime was innocent. And second, the real culprit had also raped and murdered Rashida Washington.
Match with your homicide case.
Homicide detective Rob Mooney.
The linking of the two cases through DNA was huge for us. That was a huge break. It did not, at that point, tell us who the perpetrator was, but it did tell us that there was at least one person responsible for at least two cases. And it gave us a lot more material to work with, because we have a live victim now. We have somebody that's seen the person that killed Rashida Washington, can still tell us about.
Most of the IDs were made by something else.
But the information from the database did not stop there. It appeared to Karen Dooling, who was an assistant director at the DNA lab for New York City's medical examiner, that the rapist who had turned murderer had been on a spree.
Originally, you had these two investigations that were thought to be completely separate, and one of those investigations was even thought to be part of a completely separate pattern, and how these two cases linked together. And as time went on, you know, within the next year or two in the laboratory, cases continued to link to this pattern, cases that people had no idea were this same perpetrator or that were linked to each other.
From interviews with the surviving rape victim, police developed a sketch of the suspect. It was widely circulated around the college Rashida attended and throughout the city. The investigators' hard work paid off. A woman called with an anonymous tip.
She's pretty certain that the person in the sketch is somebody that lives in her building on East 111th Street. She supplies us with the address of the building and a nickname, Ace, that she's picked up from having had contact with this person in the building. So the detectives then begin to search our databases for people at that address using that nickname.
It brings them their first suspect, a man named Aaron Key, who had a record for robbery, weapons possession, drugs, and other crimes.
There we go. We got a match.
He resembles the sketch. In addition, the surviving rape victim provided another piece of crucial information. According to prosecutor Rich Plansky,
at the crime scene, the perpetrator discarded a sweatshirt and a baseball cap. She was positive that the person who raped her was wearing both. And as it turned out, the sweatshirt had a partial laundry tag on the back.
following the only real clue they had, investigators approached dry cleaners near Key's apartment.
Tell me, sir, do you recognize that tag?
One cleaner recognized the distinctive tag as coming from his establishment. He handed over his client list.
Here's a copy.
Key's mother was on it.
Thank you very much. Give you a card. If you,
In addition to the woman in the building telling us that this is the person that she thinks is responsible for these crimes, we identify who that nickname belongs to, and we have that same person perhaps being the owner of this shirt that's left behind at the rape. So it becomes a fairly intense surveillance on Aaron at this stage of the game. We're watching him 24 hours a day in an effort to try to secure something that will yield a DNA sample. If he smokes a cigarette and throws it on the ground, if he spits out gum and throws it on the ground, if he drinks a soda and throws the bottle in the garbage, get it.
Aaron Key does none of those things. He always seems to be one step ahead of them. But police get lucky when he stumbles.
So we fill out a wanted card for Aaron Key, which means that if he gets arrested any place else in New York City, we'll get notified immediately so that we can do whatever we need to do with this person. And what happens is Aaron gets arrested in Midtown North for an attempted petit larceny.
Believing this is their chance to finally get a DNA sample, police tell Key they need to swab his cheek to test for TB before they lock him up.
But the problem here is, in order for us to be able to use that legally, he had to sign a release that clearly states this is going to be typed for DNA and it's going to be put into the medical examiner's data bank. The second that he read that, he was like, nah, you know what? He goes, I joined Jehovah's Witnesses recently, and I don't think I can do this until I consult with the elders in my church, and that was the end of that.
Not quite the end. Though Key did all he could to conceal his DNA, the authorities stayed one step ahead. They kept a close eye on him in prison, and a guard collected coffee cups from Key and adjacent inmates.
All of them are tested for DNA, all of them produce DNA, but one of them produces DNA that matches the evidence in all of these cases.
Investigators believed that Aaron Key was the assailant in all 5 cases. They simply had to match his DNA to the DNA in the database. But because of the huge number of records on file, that would take time. Time the investigators did not have. With only a petty larceny charge against him, police had to let him go. They try to keep him under surveillance, but he manages to slip away.
We have no clue where he is at this stage of the game. So now it becomes kind of a media blitz the next day. His picture is on the front page of the newspapers because that very morning that he disappears is the day that we get the DNA match back. So he's our guy.
Rapist, killer, escape artist. Aaron Key is on the loose, and he could be anywhere. In New York, DNA has linked 34-year-old Aaron Key to 5 rapes and 2 murders, but the suspect has fled. Detectives kept an eye on his apartment for days just in case he returned. Then, late one night, a light went on. Police wasted no time. But the man inside was not Aaron Key. It was his roommate. Key wasn't there and hadn't been there for days. His roommate didn't know where he was. But at that instant, the phone rang.
That's all right. No, answer it for me, please.
The roommate picks up the telephone, and I could tell just by the look on his face that it was Aaron that was on the phone. I said, give me the phone. They said, you got to come in. Every cop in New York City's got your picture right now.
Key agrees to meet with Detective Mooney to turn himself in.
He says, but I don't want to step out and have 100 cops jumping on me. He says, I just want you by yourself, meet me in the street. So I go, okay, no problem. I said, but make no mistake about it. Don't come in the block with your hands in your pockets or we're going to have a problem.
Police don't want to play any games with Key, and they get his cell phone records to try to pinpoint where he was making the call. They want to pick him up before he has a chance to run again. But they are too late.
While I'm having this conversation with him where he's telling me that he's on a number 6 train on his way uptown to come and turn himself in, he's actually at Penn Station in Newark, New Jersey.
Police then set about using credit card and phone records to try to find Aaron Key. The trail leads them south.
I call up our tech people and I say, listen, dump this phone right now, meaning the phone that was the receiving end of that telephone call. We have that number. I want all the phone calls that came in between these 2 time periods. They determined that this telephone call came from a phone booth in downtown Miami. The next morning, myself and another detective were on a flight.
After arriving in Florida, police tracked down the phone booth Key used. It was located directly in front of a hotel.
We pull into the parking lot and we're setting up and we're figuring we're going to be here all day sitting here watching this hotel to see what happens. And not 5 minutes later, here comes Aaron walking down the street and he's with a young girl. So I'm thinking, this is bad. This is like victim number 9 walking right past us here.
3 p.m.
New York detectives, accompanied by Miami police and SWAT team, descended upon the hotel and sealed the exits.
Let's go upstairs.
They've got Key trapped. along with all of the other guests and hotel staff. Law enforcement swept the hotel, room by room, in search of the elusive key.
We have an emergency. For your own safety, we need you to clear the building right now.
At last, they find him. Key puts up no resistance, and the girl is safe. If police hadn't found him so quickly, the girl might have become his next victim. Their quick reactions probably saved her life. Key was extradited to New York, where he spent several hours denying his involvement. Even in the face of scientific evidence, investigators needed to find a way to get Key to talk. And one of them suggested that maybe his girlfriend could get him to confess. Against Detective Mooney's better judgment, Key's girlfriend was allowed to see him.
And he spills everything. He admits to every one of the crimes. And of course cannot offer an explanation for why he did it, just that he did do it. This all becomes good, usable evidence for us at trial, because it was unsolicited. She wasn't sent in there as an agent of the police for any reason. In fact, I argued that she shouldn't go into the room.
Though Aaron Key had girlfriends, he was a sexual predator who enjoyed taking women by force. Rashida Washington lived in the same building as Key. She must have known him. And in his mind, because she could recognize him, she had to die. Rich Plansky was the prosecutor.
The case wouldn't have been solved without forensic evidence. Forensic evidence did three things in this case. Number one, it identified Aaron Key for us. Because he left his DNA on 5 of our 7 victims, in the end, it told us this was the right guy. Number two, it exonerated a number of innocent people, 2 of whom had been arrested and identified in lineups for 2 of the rapes. And number three, it was instrumental in helping us convict Aaron Key and putting him away for the rest of his life.
Key was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
The bottom line is this person is off the board forever. You won't see him anymore. And had he not been taken off the board, more crimes would certainly have been committed.
A killer's motivation remains a mystery, but the residue of his crime lingers. Thanks to the tireless work of forensic scientists, when a murder occurs, it is impossible for the killer to simply vanish.